currently work for the ESO, and on the P4 work stream, taking over from all the great work that Alex did prior to that to get versions 1.1 and 1.2 out of the door. And I'd say with me is my co-presenting on this is my colleague Abisola, who also works for the ESO in the contracts team and has been heavily involved since she joined in the spring to sort of help get to this point. Go to the next slide, please. So just a quick introduction of how we got to where we are now. So I think the key thing to pull out on this is that as per all the previous versions, version 2 was developed by a cross of resources that came from across the DNO and the ESO, and you can see these listed down on the right hand side of your screen here. So it wasn't done in isolation. It is a collaborative effort across the DNOs and the ESO to get to this point in time, with a tremendous amount of sort of time and effort, and using the experience and knowledge from across the sector to be able to develop where we are now. So just to go back, version 2 of the standard agreement is currently out for consultation. This is why we got the webinar here. The webinar is part of that process, and it closes on the 22nd of October. So the reason that version 2 came around is that that structure wouldn't accommodate the ESA's auction style. They had a procurement and contract award, but equally going forward wouldn't support some of the newer services which the organisations are looking to procure. So hence one of the key objectives for version 2 was the creation of a single approach for the implementation of across the DNOs and the ESOs, and the simplification of those contracts and the sort of the wording within those contract terms. If you can just move on to the next screen, please, Connor. So this is sort of the timeline and time frame of how we've got to where we are now. So as I say, the product team was kicked off in January 2019, and it sort of worked on a 12-month program to develop the initial standard agreement for the DNOs to use, which we call version 1. Then in April 2022, version 1.1 of the standard agreement was launched, and this was looking back at all the things that had been learnt from version 1 and adapting these to create further alignment across the organisations to produce this document. Then working in the tail end of 2020 for delivering February 2021 was version 1.2, and again this was further alignment of the agreement, but also was based on stakeholder feedback that had been received from the previous versions, and we sort of looked at acting on that and how the contract, where applicable, could embrace that feedback and act on it to involve it. And then in September 2021, where we published the standard agreement version 2, which was based on the need, sort of looking forward of what was going to be needed there. So this is, I think Abisola mentioned earlier, this is the first agreement which will be able to be adapted and used by both the DNOs and the ESO. It looks at how to improve accessibility and facilitate participation from sort of non-traditional parties to provide services. And as I said from the previous slide, there was also a focus on how to simplify the language contained within the actual contract itself. We should just move on to the next slide, please, Connor. So how was version 2 developed? So version 2 is the latest version of the standard agreement which is going to be used. And this is the first version of the standard agreement which facilitates a more agile procurement and contract award process. And it does this by moving to a framework-based structure and aligning the schedules to be more service specific. So in a few slides time, we'll look at how that structure has the look and feel around it, and go through sort of how we got to that that position. So, in a nutshell, version 2 was developed using best practices from the ESO's current framework and contracting processes. For those of you who are familiar with those, it would be referred to as the ABC process. And this is the process that's currently being used for the services that the ESO buys, such as dynamic containment and store. And it also took the best practices from version 1.2 and the standard agreement. So where we had a preferred set of wording for a particular clause, that was adapted into that structure. As I say, we've taken the existing clauses from each of the general terms from the ESO structure and from version 1.2. And like I said, we've done some work to simplify those clauses so that they work for all parties. And one of the key things we looked at when developing version 2 was not only how we do make and procure services now across the industry, but going forward, what we're going to be able to do, what's going to be required, and how do we build in that flexibility. So as new services are developed across the organisations, even across different ENA work streams, for example, if the product alignment, how do we make this future-proof? How do we make it so that we can add additional services in and make it so it's, keep using the word agile, but an agile agreement to enable us to do that. And then, so last but not least, on it, one of the other consideration I keep going was the simplification of language. This was something that came back as from the feedback from version 1.1 and version 1.2. Next slide, please. So the feedback that we received, which went into version 2, you can see here. So this was what received. And it addresses a couple of the points, and version 2 does address these. So it's accessibility, so how providers can access all of the markets if they have the assets to do so. Simplification and conciseness of the clauses. Inclusion of aggregated assets in addition to the single sort of DER units. Addressing the liabilities and indemnity clauses, which is we've been working on since the conception, but we've actually got to a landing place of how these now fit and work. Obligations placed on providers, and then sort of the question around data, equipment, and access rights to site. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So. So the key, I go back to the two key changes for version 2, which is the framework structure. So version 2 successfully secured the alignment between the ESO processes and the DNOs by introducing a contractual framework structure. And this gives the flexibility and allows contract awards and contracts to be procurement events to be run range from sort of day-ahead auction style tenders through to agreements such as bilaterals if required, or longer term contracts that may be required for constraints, etc. So it gives us flexibility as an industry to award a variety of style of contracts through a variety of style of procurement processes. And to enable us to do that, what we did is the schedules that you may have been familiar with version 1.2 were restructured, and these were restructured so they're now a service based structure, and there's the next slide demonstrates how this will look and feel. And each of these service-based structures will define how each service is procured and how it's provided, and there's some real advantages to this style of structure. And this was based on feedback that we'd had from the ESO when we were looking initially to develop this structure in 2019, is that it focuses providers on a pool of information that is just relevant to that service. So you can pick it up as a whole and you can look at it and understand what the service is, how it's going to be required, rather than going into sort of various pots of information to be able to do that. It also allows each of the contractual documents or any service that needs to go under a consultation, for example, to be isolated. So you can isolate that service and put just that particular service under consultation, rather than having to put the entire schedule structure under consultation. And again, that makes it really clean when it comes to knowing what you're going to be consulting on, and also when it comes to the process of sort of having that consultation output approved by industry or indeed by the regulators. So the next page demonstrates how those structures look. So those of you who are familiar with the ABC contracting structure that the ESO currently does will be familiar with this. So on top of you'll see there's the overarching general terms and conditions, which are the standard agreement, which is out for consultation. And underneath that, there will be a general glossary. And the general glossary is the glossary that will contain terms that are non-service specific. So if there's if there's a reference to grid code or to general industry terms, they will sit into that. And then if you look along the 4 examples we've got there, we've got if you view these sort of in a vertical manner. So if you take to the right hand side here, you've got service terms for DNO active services, and then underneath, so that will be schedule 1, and then underneath that you'll have the glossary for DNO active services. So this is a secondary glossary which is specific for that service, which will go into it will only apply for sort of things which are applicable to that. Then we have annexes. So annexes is a generic area which service-specific documents will sit, such as if there's a testing requirement, or if there is a set of auction rules, or if there's the performance monitoring formulas, for example, for that particular service, will sit in under the annexes part of those. And then you come to one where we're going to call forms and templates. So this is if you need to complete a master data form, for example, or tender spreadsheets. They'll all be located in this folder here, so you'll be able to pick them up and use them there. And then the signatures. So this is your contractual. This is the documents that you'll sign contractually, either to sign up to the framework agreement, or if there's a negotiated contract that is going to be used, that you'll be able to find that in there. So in the instance of the ones that I'm familiar with, this is where you'd find your A, B, and C contracting forms that you sign and your related entities sign. If you can move on to the next slide, please, Connor. So this is what this slide shows here is down the left-hand side is what the proposed structure is. And then in the green, you'll see sort of what it is and what's now fed into those that new structure. So as you can see, beforehand in version 1.2, we had a combined sort of set of general terms and a glossary, and these have now been separated out. And then in your service terms, this is now where your existing schedules were, and it will denote what the service description is, sort of where service windows are, for example, technical requirements, and things like that. Then you'll have, like I say, you've got your service specific glossary, which is the new thing we've introduced, and then your annexes. So in the old world, in version 1.2, this is where these would now include like schedules 4, 5, 6, and 7 for the DNO agreements. And then from an ESO perspective, this is where you'll find things like your tender rules and your testing guidance, auction rules, etc. guidance documents. And then your forms and your templates here will be, like say, such as your forms for unavailability, for example, performance reports, and things like master data templates. And then, as I said before, your signatures. This is where your ABC and your agreement forms will form part of that. So, as you can see, a lot of them are very similar. It's more this is being reworded for a consistent approach across the services as we add them. So, whilst the documents in there will change and the contents within there will change, the actual structure of the schedules will remain the same when we introduce or new services are introduced underneath this new standard agreement. So, Connor, if you can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So again, this is just a little bit of more of a little bit of detail, and this is for information, but also hopefully gives you an insight of sort of the work that the team took on here to be able to get to this structure and to ensure that it works. And this was sort of a brief snapshot of the mapping exercise that we did here. So on this particular one here, we're focusing on the annexes. As you can see, that's highlighted in a slightly larger box, but when this is circulated, you'll be able to see how it did apply to the others. And you know, the discussions within the wider P4 team was, you know, with this structure, what's going to fit where, and you know, what made logical sense to make sure that it went into the right place, and it was easy for people who were looking to contract with, you know, the DNOs or the ESOs to be able to follow this in a really simplistic way. So you know, again, this was looking at breaking it down, so where we could make it so it was a common. So for example, the service terms at the top will always be the service terms will be at the top. And this is looking at the annexes and what goes in there, and this just gives a brief sort of flavour of the more of the bespoke documents that are required for those services. So if you sort of just look at the bottom part of this, for example, the ESO side this is where all the testing guides and stuff documentation sits. And the reason it sits there is that sometimes across the services testing isn't required. So this is where the annexes come in. It's the folder where you know, those bespoke documents that aren't necessarily applicable across all of the services will sit into that. So that is the overview of the sort of where we've got to, how we've got to version 2, how it was created, and sort of some of the, hopefully an insight of the thought of an insight, the thought and insight of you know, how we've got to version 2 that we're at for consultation now. I'm now going to hand you over to Abisola, who's going to go through some of the feedback points in a little bit more detail and some of the key changes within that the clauses. So over to you, Abisola.
Thanks, Andy. If you could go on to the next slide, please, Connor. Thank you. So this slide highlights key changes to version 2 of the standard agreement resulting from previous feedback on version 1.2. The first is in respect of inclusion of aggregators. So the feedback was that the standard agreement needed to be adjusted to ensure that it worked more for aggregators, including the aggregation of demand response from smaller assets. Now, version 1.2 had addressed this to some extent by the removal of singular terminology and the use of pluralized statements. Now, within version 2, there's a recognition that certain actions are not directly under the control of aggregators, and that in such instances, aggregators would need to procure that these actions are in turn performed by the asset owners. So that there's just that recognition that it's not always under the direct control of aggregators, and that there's just room for some flexibility for an allowance for them to then contact the asset owners to perform such obligations. The second point is in relation to access and the requirements for site access. Now, the previous feedback was that it's not acceptable to many customers or providers to give DNOs an unrestricted right of entry, even with notice. So the subject clause, which is clause 4.17 in this case, has been relaxed even further within version 1. Within version 2. I beg your pardon. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this slide highlights one of the key issues that was carried over from version 1.2, and that's liabilities and indemnities. And the objective for the product team with this provision has been the harmonization of the liabilities and indemnities provision across the DNOs and the ESO. The liabilities and indemnities provision has now been amended to align with the ESO's model, so under which there's a general cap on liability for asset damage, and with specific limits for the DNOs and the ESO. Furthermore, I would say that specific indemnities in relation to each service are set out in service-specific schedules. So essentially, what you have is that there's consistent wording across the services, but values may be adjusted or set depending on associated risk. Just on a final note with regards to this slide, I'd like to highlight that the caps are strictly for contractual failures, and such as the non-provision of services or material breaches. Liabilities and indemnities in relation to fraud, death, or personal injury are and will continue to be exceptions to the caps that are set in the standard agreement. And the next slide, please. So this slide just shows a cross-section of other changes that have been made to the standard agreement. And the first is records and audits. So version 2 makes a distinction between financial performance and contractual data, and of course the ensuing data retention obligations. So financial and contractual data are required to be kept for 7 years, whilst performance data is required to be retained for 4 years, except of course the annexes state otherwise, in which this would refer to the ESO, where the annexes state that performance data should only be kept for a period of 3 months. Regards to confidentiality, what the product team did was that the simplicity of version 1.2 was retained, whilst we also made updates to allow the sharing and publication of relevant data to enable greater industry transparency. And this is really against the backdrop of the drive within the industry for greater transparency and publication of data, like locational data and generation type. For regards to dispute resolution, version 2 adopts a layered approach to dispute resolution, and counterparties have access to different dispute resolution mechanisms. So as a first resort, parties would seek to resolve their disputes amicably through negotiation, failing which they're free to explore mediation or take steps to commence arbitration or refer the disputes for expert determination. I think in summary, what this does really is to show a clearly defined pathway for dispute resolution. Another point on inclusion is the inclusion of community bodies and charitable groups, and of course, smaller scale DERs. Updates have been made within version 2 to recognize participation by entities other than bodies corporate. This thereby accommodating small-scale flexibility services providers, community bodies, and charitable groups. We consider that this would ensure ensure increased participation in the provision of flexibility services and ultimately drive competition in the market. Now, the last sort of 2 points are in relation to termination. So the first is termination for convenience. So version 2 retains each party's right to termination for convenience, and this is particularly useful for smaller providers, just so they're not locked into the contract and they can terminate for convenience. And the last point is in relation to change of ownership, and specifically termination due to change of ownership. So change of ownership is no longer considered a material breach of the agreement as it was in version 1.2. And the relevant clause has also been updated to ensure that the company, which is in this case the ESO and the DNOs, can terminate for change of ownership if the provider or the new controlling entity fails to meet reasonable due diligence checks. So that's, I guess my cross section is done, and at this point, I'll hand over to Andy Rice for a summary and next steps.
Hi, thanks, Abizola, for that. So just to conclude the presentation, just going through a sort of a summary. So what we're hoping is that version 2, despite there's been a huge amount of work gone into getting to this point, it should have a very familiar feel around it, because it's based on the existing ESO framework and clauses from version from 1.2 of the existing standard agreement. So, you know, there's nothing really new here, but there's a lot of work gone into making it you know, work across the industry. Again, just reiterating that looking forward, this is an agile agreement, and the schedule structure it can be used for existing and new products and services as they're developed by the ESO. So again, it was something that we looked at, so we considered we looked at going forward. So there's not going to be, whilst there will be changes in version 3 and 4 as there's greater alignment coming into place, you know, we believe that we've got a really good broad-based structure that we can sort of build upon here. There's the flexibility in there to allow for awarding contracts either on a daily or, if you wanted to, an either block basis, whilst also having the ability to sort of award contracts where required on a longer term basis as well. So it gives flexibility again across the DNOs and the ESOs to be able to do that. It was built, as I say, in mind with the future in mind, so we can add services as they go live and change. In terms of sort of some of the next steps, so the consultation is going to close on the 22nd of October, and I'd encourage you all to please respond to that with either support for the standard agreement or suggestions for areas that you feel need addressing. Both are really important for the consultation to and for version 2 to be a success. And in terms of the timelines after the 22nd, so the P4 team will review and consider feedback from the consultation, and then what we'll do is we will look at making any necessary or changes needed. And this exercise will take place sort of the latter part of October and throughout November. And then the final version of the version 2 will seek approval in December, with the aim that the final versions will be published in December 2021, with a view that these services can be the standard agreement will then be used from 2022 onwards, as we either go out with new services or we can adopt them for existing services. So in terms of the presentation, that is it from us. I'm going to move on to the Q&A session. I'm hoping you've got questions for us, otherwise it's going to be a long half an hour. So Connor, over to yourself. Is there any in the chat?
No, we haven't received any questions in the chat, so now is your chance really. And is anyone that's attended, do you have any questions on any of the major changes that have been made? Is there anything that's perhaps unclear from this, or maybe you've read part of the standard agreement itself? Okay, I think that's probably a fairly positive sign that it's all straightforward. Hopefully this isn't a major departure from what you've previously used in kind of, well, I guess it's the procurement of your flexibility for the networks. Does anyone have any, it's perhaps not what we're specifically consulting on, but any thoughts on anything that we should consider including that hasn't been? If you prefer to come off camera rather than type and speak your question, very welcome to do so.
kind of worth offering that, you know, if people want to go and there's a month to go in the consultation. If you've got any questions during that time, if you can email them through, and then as the P4 workstream, we'll address those and we'll publish the results on the ENA forum.
Okay, I guess just before I draw it to a close then, yes, we'll send around a copy of the slides end of play tomorrow with some information on how you can respond to the consultation itself. So if you do want to take this material away or have a read through the standard agreement itself, and it's rather short, much reduced in length than it was from previous versions. You have until, or test my memory here, on
22nd
consultations. Yeah, it's the 22nd of October that's open to. So it seems that no one does have any questions, which I'll take as a rather positive thing, but if you are able to provide your feedback to that consultation, that'd be fantastic. It helps us know where we should be trying to evolve this in the future. We want to make it as easy as possible for flexibility providers to engage with the networks and to sell their flexibility. Yeah. We're very much encouraging a growth in the market. We want to see this. It greatly helps in the transition towards net zero. And I think the incentive from your perspective is rather obvious. So if you're able to provide any feedback on that, that'd be fantastic. Details will be sent around the end of play tomorrow. And as always, you can contact us directly at Open Networks, simply opennetworks@energynetworks.org. So thank you all for your time. Hopefully you found that very useful. If you can respond, that would be fantastic. I will see you all next time. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Connor.
Thanks, Connor.
Thanks, guys. Good presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, guys.